Hello, everybody, and thanks for being here. I hope you are not here just for that quiz money. So thank you for the organizers for having me here to talk about Bob Wilson's and Paul Milgrom's work. Now, just to introduce myself, my name is Igor. I am an adjunct at the Economics Institute. I'm originally from Russia, and I did my master's and undergrad degrees there. And then I obtained my PhD from Northwestern University in the US. And now it's my second year at KU. I do research in information economics, so I'm quite well acquainted with the research outputs of these two fine gentlemen. However, in order to present their outputs and put them in context, I feel like it is most instructive to start with a historical perspective and to try to trace how the economics saw markets over the course of its development. Now, if you have taken a single course in economics, and even if you haven't, I bet you have seen this picture and that you know that all of economics is all about supply and demand. That there is some magical supply curve, some magical demand curve in market for any good, and they intersect at some point, and that is the equilibrium price and the equilibrium quantity that is traded in that market. The idea behind this picture is that even if individual agents have some kind of private information, for example, how much they're willing to pay for this product, or what is their cost of producing this product, this information is aggregated by the market, aggregated by this equilibrium price, and then is used by all other agents in the society to base their decisions over or around. And to give you a particular quote, here is one by Friedrich von Hayek from 1945-ish. And he said that fundamentally in a system in which the knowledge of relevant facts is dispersed among many different people, prices can act to coordinate the separate actions of different people. And this was the view around the middle of last century. And this view was that it's enough to view things at this bird's eye scale, that the exact way in which agents interact is not particularly relevant. However, then some other people came and got a Nobel Prize for it. Namely, George Akerlof, Michael Spence, and Joseph Stiglitz all have shown various ways throughout the 70s in which asymmetric information in markets can break the markets down, or can lead to prices not aggregating information, can lead to market outcomes being inefficient. What's more important is that the extent to which the markets got broken, the extent to which the prices were inefficient, depended in part on how we model the markets, how the markets are organized. And all of this led the profession to recognize that demand and supply curves are not just entities in themselves. They are shaped by the interaction of different agents who are present in the market, by a crowd of sellers, by a crowd of buyers, and the exact way in which they interact is important. And the game theory that developed in parallel with that process in the second half of the 20th century gave the profession the instrument to analyze this interaction. Now, how can we model this interaction? How can we model a market? Probably the simplest way to do this is to say that whenever a seller and a buyer meet, they just have to negotiate the terms of trade amongst themselves one-on-one. And this is called bargaining process. There is a lot of economic literature on that, but this is not what our talk is about. So I will just quickly swipe that under the rug and move on to another way in which we can model the markets, namely an auction. An auction is basically a situation in which we have one seller and many buyers. Of course, it's not the only way it can be, but for simplicity, let's restrict to that picture. Now, when I say auction, what probably comes to mind is a picture of a hall of a room full of people dressed in expensive outfits, and an auctioneer on the scene shouting 120, 130, do I hear 140? And this is one way in which auctions can be organized. This would be an English auction or an ascending price auction. but you can, for example, have auctions in which different participants submit their bids in secret to some central entity, to some coordinator. This would be a sealed bid auction. And then if the winner pays their own bid, it would be a first prize sealed bid auction. You can have a second prize sealed bid auction in which the winner pays the second highest price. And this, for example, is the way in which display advertisements are sold. Whenever you visit a website or whenever you open a mobile app, you see this contextual ad. An auction is run for this ad in real time by the advertiser, by Google or whoever else it is. So auctions are everywhere and they take many different forms. And the question is, how can we optimally organize auctions? Now, one answer to this question has been given by William Vickrey, another Nobel laureate, this time from 1996. And you might get an impression that we're moving back in time a little bit, but don't worry, we're getting back to 2020 soon enough. So William Vickrey explored a very simple auction. And it goes as follows. Imagine that we have one entity for sale, like this cone of ice cream, which is blue for some reason. And we have different bidders who are potentially interested in this cone of ice cream. Now, this person does not really like ice cream. They prefer chocolate, so they are not willing to pay much for this cone of ice cream. This person on top likes ice cream a lot. It's a warm day, so they are willing to pay a lot for this cone of ice cream. So the question once again is, how do we as auctioneer, as market designers, organize the interaction in this market, the bidding process between these different bidders for this cone of ice cream? And what Vickrey obtained, the result that he obtained, said that with private valuations, all auction formats are equivalent. So it does not really matter how you organize this auction. Sealed bid, open outcry, I don't know, standing on one leg. In all of these auction formats, the expected revenue of the auctioneer it would be the same if the auctioneer values standing on one leg, that is. And the expected utilities of the participants would also be the same. However, what is this quantifier with private valuations? Basically what this means is that whatever valuation I have is irrelevant to your valuation. You like ice cream and it's a warm day, so you do not care about what I think about this ice cream. My information is irrelevant to your valuation. And this is where our heroes of the day come in. Paul Milgrom and Bob Wilson are famous for their contributions to common value auctions. And the story goes as follows. Sometime in the 1960s, the US Department of Interior asked Bob Wilson to oversee the auction for mineral rights. So basically different oil companies were bidding for plots of land from which they could extract oil. However, the whole uncertainty in that process was how much oil is there in this plot of land? And it's a very tricky thing to estimate. It is difficult even now with all of our fancy computers and technology, and imagine how difficult it was back in the 60s. So all of different oil companies had some estimate of how much oil there was in this plot of land. But nobody knew for sure. So this oil company thought, well, there's probably not that much oil here. I'm not willing to bid high. While this company thought, hey, this must be very rich in oil. We should really bid heavily on it. However, imagine that this company bid heavily and won the auction. What do they learn from this? They find out that, hey, my estimate was actually higher than everybody else's. And I do not really have any good reason to believe that my estimate is better than anybody else's. So I thought there was a lot of oil in this field, but other bidders did not share my conviction. So I won, but maybe I did not win the item which is as good as I thought it is. And so Bob Wilson's contribution is exactly that. It's realizing that in these common value auctions, where the item being auctioned has the same value for all participants, but nobody is quite sure what this value is, in such auctions, bidders must account for the winner's curse, for the fact that you are more likely to win the auction when you overestimate the value of the item being auctioned, as compared to the case when you underestimate it. And this is the big idea. Then enters Paul Milgrom, who was, by the way, Bob Wilson's student back in the day. Paul Milgrom took this idea and applied it to many different settings. For example, in his paper with Bob Weber in '92, they argued that in auctions, whenever a common value component is present, Vickrey's result, which said that we do not really actually care what kind of auctions we run, because they're all the same, this result no longer holds, and the format of the auction now actually matters. And in particular, what they found is that the English auction would get you more revenue than a sealed bid second price auction, which would get you more revenue than a sealed bid first price auction. And the idea here is that in the English auction, you can observe everybody else around you. You can observe how all other bidders behave. So you can observe how they bid. And from that, you can make better inferences about what kind of information they have. So in English auction, every bidder gets a lot of information about all other bidders, which is absent in sealed bid auctions. In second price auction, as compared to the first price auction, the bidders, there is not more information because both of them are sealed bid, but the second price auction provides you with a little bit of insurance. And think of it this way. Suppose you won the auction. If you won it by a very thin margin, so the second bidder bid almost as much, but not quite as much, then you know that the item is probably good, but you have to pay a lot for it. You have to pay the second highest bid. While in the other case, if you win, but the second bidder, but you won by a mile, the second bid was nowhere near, then you realize that, whoops, winner's curse is actually a thing. Others' estimates of the item are not as good as you thought they were. So you won a lemon, a bad item. But on the upside, since the second bid is very low, you do not have to pay that much for it. So with risk-averse bidders, I would be more prone. Risk-averse bidders would bid more on average in second price auction than in first price auction, giving more revenue to the auctioneer. Now, another seminal contribution of Paul Milgrom is with Nancy Stokoe in the same 1982. And they look at double auctions, where bidders compete for buying the item and sellers compete for selling the item. And the best way to think of it is probably in the context of financial markets, where suppose you have some stock, like Google. You have a bunch of people who have the stock and might be looking to potentially sell it. And then on the one hand, you have a group of people who do not have the stock, but may potentially be interested in buying it. The stock is worth exactly the same amount to everybody. It's just the stock is a discounted cash flow of future revenues. And we can assume that everybody values it the same. But nobody quite knows what this is, what this value of this, what this stock is worth, because nobody can see the future perfectly. Everybody has their own estimates, but nobody knows for sure. And what Milgrom and Stokoe show is that in such an auction, there can never be any trade, which is a very shocking result. But the intuition behind it is very simple. Imagine that we are in such a double auction, and you and I have agreed to trade. So you agreed to sell me the stock at some certain price. Then if this was the case, then I would start thinking, if you want to sell me the stock at this price, then it's probably because you value the stock less than this. Then you have information which suggests that the stock is worth less than the price that I'm going to pay for it. But if this is the case, why should I buy it? Why should I buy a worthless stock if you don't want to hold it at this price? Conversely, you should make this the mirror inference. You should think, if I want to buy the stock at this price, then I have the information that value of the stock is probably above this price. Then why should you sell it? You'd better keep the stock to yourself, because then you get a stock that's worth a lot, and you do not get that. But you would get a very low price if you decided to sell it to me. So a very intriguing result about common value auctions, let's say that. And then another paper that is worth mentioning is a paper by Larry Gloston and Paul Milgrom from 1985, written when Larry Gloston was still a PhD student. So, imagine you being a PhD student and writing one of the very influential papers in financial markets. Everybody would want that, wouldn't they? And what they say is that in financial markets, bid and ask prices are necessarily different, and they must be different. So in financial markets, bid price is the price that market quotes you to buy the stock from you, at which you can sell the stock to the market. Ask price is the price at which you, individual trader, can buy the stock from the market. And in real world, bid and ask prices are different. So there is a wedge. There is no a single price of a stock. There is always a bid price and ask price. But what they show here is that these prices must necessarily be different because of this winner's curse. Because the market accounts for the information that is conveyed by your individual trade. Because if you are willing to sell the asset to the market, then it is because you do not value the stock that much. It's probably because you have some bad information about the stock value. So the price at which the market is willing to buy the stock from you is below the valuation that the market had for the stock before. And vice versa. If you are willing to buy the stock from the market, then it's probably because you have some good information about the stock value, because you want to hold the stock, because you think it's sold too cheaply. And then again, the market incorporates this piece of information into the ask price. So bid and ask prices are different, but they are efficiently different because they incorporate the information that is conveyed by individual trades. So this is the winner's curse, and a few ways in which the winner's curse can manifest in different environments, a few ways in which we can think of winner's curse. However, winner's curse and common value auctions are not the only contributions of Bob Wilson and Paul Milgrom to auction theory and to economics in general. In particular, another thing that they are quite famous for is for their work on spectrum auctions, as many of you have guessed in the quiz. Now, the story is that the two of them were invited by the Federal Communications Commission in the US to design an auction for selling radio frequency bands to wireless carriers, such as cell phone operators. And that's pretty much it, I guess, back in the 80s. There was no wireless internet back then, but there may have been some TV channels. So there were a few problems with those auctions, and the first of those problems is not actually in any way specific to them. And I'm sure that if you have ever bid on anything on eBay, you have encountered these problems. If you've ever done that, you know that it makes no sense to bid in an auction a week or a day before it closes, because the whole action is happening in the very last seconds or minutes. Because everybody is willing to snipe the item at the very last second. And at the same time, people are not willing to bid beforehand so as to not reveal that they have high valuation for this asset, because that could potentially start a bid war. But if you snipe the item at the very last second, then you would save yourself the time and the money. So Milgrom and Wilson solved this by designing a special auction format that accounts for both of these. And this is called simultaneous multiple round auction with activity rule. So what does this entail? They thought there is no sniping if there is no last period. And the idea is, If you bid in the very last second before the auction closes, then the deadline for the auction is automatically extended so that all other bidders have a chance to respond. Simple, yet elegant and effective. On the other hand, bid withholding would still be a problem. You would bid in a period that you think is the last for a given frequency or for a given item. They solved it by introducing an activity rule, saying that you are only eligible to bid in a given auction if you have bid in this auction in all the previous periods. So you cannot all of a sudden show up and say, I now want this. You should articulate your interest in this item or this frequency band from the very beginning. And this is the simultaneous multiple round auction with Milgrom-Wilson activity rule. Now, there is another problem with spectrum auctions, namely that they are very difficult. There are many different frequencies being sold in many different locations. And your valuation for a given band depends on what other bands you get. So, for example, there might be geographical complementarities, saying that I want both North California and South California, so that I can advertise coverage over all of California. But one without the other is of no value to me. Or, for example, you can value having one band in a given region, but the second band in this region would be worthless to you. Or you can value adjacent bands because then you can offer more coverage, more services, things like that. So valuations across different items are not independent within a single bidder. And so the simple solution for that was to allow participants to bid for bundles of frequencies, but then the problem just explodes in complexities because there are many individual items sold initially, and now you combine them in all possible combinations into bundles, and this just explodes the number of items for sale exponentially, or even worse than exponentially. So Paul Milgrom and co-authors did a lot of work on these combinatorial auctions and trying to develop formats that would incentivize truthful bidding in these auctions. But I will not go into detail on how exactly they did it. Now, moving on from spectrum auctions, another market that has benefited greatly from our laureates' activity is electricity markets. Bob Wilson in particular has done plenty of work in electricity markets in the past 30 years. And electricity markets are insanely difficult and insanely complicated because there you must have demand and supply balanced at every point in time. You cannot sell electricity and say, I'll deliver it to you tomorrow. Oh, sorry, I couldn't do it, maybe in 2 days. No, there must be balances at every point in time. And so forward auctions and spot auctions are combined there. So you have day-ahead markets, and then you also have instantaneous markets for last-second adjustments. You have a lot of technical constraints, such as transmission constraints on how much electricity can the infrastructure carry from one point to another. Then there is complexity in the impossibility to direct the flow of electricity. You cannot deliver electricity from point A to point B. You can only deliver electricity to the grid or from the grid. Then you have various reserve requirements, which are also very difficult to accommodate because, in principle, reserve generators are available to pick up the slack, but they take a lot of time to spin up. And then, finally, with the rise of renewable energy, their unstable supply of electricity, of wind farms and solar farms in particular, does contribute a lot to volatility in electricity markets. So there are many different factors to take into account in electricity markets, and Bob Wilson has done, again, plenty of work trying to account for at least some of them. So this is it for auctions. And even though Nobel Prize is usually given for some relatively narrow contribution to the field, both Bob and Paul have done plenty of work in many other areas of economics. I told you that game theory was kind of developing in parallel with this market investigation, market game analysis. And Bob Wilson has contributed to the development of game theory as well as to the analysis of markets and auction formats. So one of the popular equilibrium concepts, called sequential equilibrium, is due to Bob Wilson and his colleague from Stanford, David Krebs. Then he has also contributed to algorithmic game theory, which is often disregarded in economics but is a very fascinating field. It has to do with how difficult the games are to solve computationally. And this is very relevant in, for example, spectrum auctions, where you have many players and many different items. The computational constraints really do kick in. I mentioned bargaining today as another possible market microstructure, and Bob Wilson has some work in that as well as in pricing in connected markets, selling bundles of items rather than individual items, pricing under capacity constraints, and other I/O topics. Paul Milgrom has also written a few I/O papers with John Roberts, but every single one of them hit the spot and is now classical in industrial organization. So Paul Milgrom has written on limit pricing, which is when a firm prices so low that nobody seems worth it to enter a given industry because they think the entry would be unprofitable. Then there is predatory pricing, when basically the same happens except a firm tries to set low prices in order to drive the competitors out of the market. They have a paper on using advertisements as possible costly signals. And many of these have to do with building up reputation and sustaining it. Building up a reputation as a predator. Building up a reputation for having a good product. Building up a reputation for having low costs and thus being able to compete in limit pricing. So, there are also more general contributions by Paul to repeated games literature, and another popular application of this literature is to incentives in organizations, where individual workers are trying to convince their upper management, their bosses, that they are of high ability, and the workers are competing for promotions. So if you're interested in these and other things, we have a lot of courses at KU that you can take and learn more about these. In particular, Microeconomics 2 and 3 give you a solid background on game theory that you can then take and apply to a selection of our bachelor's and master's courses, such as those on auctions. This is the dedicated class devoted solely to investigating auctions and all the different formats the auctions can take. We have a course on industrial organization, of course, about how firms compete with each other for consumers. We have a course on financial markets devoted largely to this winner's curse in financial markets, in figuring out how can we structure financial markets to foster trade, to foster pricing in these markets to be efficient. And then more broadly, we have a course on mechanism design, which tackles a broader question of how can we design environments and just markets in general to achieve the desired outcome. How can we manipulate the agent's incentives to get to the outcome that we want? Now, I see that I'm almost out of time, but I'll take just one more minute to tell you one fun story. Show that Nobel laureates are people as well. So, I guess many of you have seen this photo, but for those of you who don't, when Nobel Committee was announcing the prizes, or when they do this, they usually do this by phone. And they could not reach Paul Milgrom by phone to tell him that he's won the Nobel Prize. So what happened is that his kind neighbor, which is one Bob Wilson, came to tell him that in person. So one other aspect to the story is that when it's noon in Stockholm, in the Nobel Prize Committee, in California, it's somewhere between 2 and 3 a.m. So this is a picture taken by the security camera in Paul Milgrom's house of Bob Wilson trying to wake him up at 3 a.m. in the morning to tell him that he's won the Nobel Prize. And with this fun piece of trivia, I will stop here. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for being here. And as I understand, we now have some time for questions.